Hey, welcome to this week's episode of Confirmation 2.0. We're in week 3. My name is Pastor Matt.
And I'm Pastor Casey.
And we're pumped to be with you this week. So, this week, we are looking at, in our first year confirmation, we're looking at the book of Exodus, which I love the book of Exodus. It's kind of a fun story because you've watched in Genesis as kind of like you see the picture of the whole world. It's moved down to just this one family, and then God's going to work redemption through this one family. You find out this one family explodes and multiplies, so you get to see the fruitfulness that God promised Abram, and you see that pop in Exodus, but then you find the people enslaved. And so in Exodus, you're going to see God acts as a powerful rescuer and redeemer, showing his faithfulness to his people and to his promises. And then we're going to jump into the second commandment. And then that's what we're doing in our second year. So let's start by diving into the book of Exodus.
So like you said before, Matt, the people of Israel have multiplied into a big people, and they've moved now from the land that Abraham settled into the land of Egypt, where they are now enslaved under Pharaoh. And God raises up a deliverer for the people in a guy named Moses. And the story begins to follow Moses' life. You see that Moses is born in Egypt, raised in the house of Pharaoh's daughter. After a few events happen, Moses winds up fleeing from Egypt, and it's there that he has an encounter with God. And it's a pretty miraculous and famous encounter. He encounters God in a burning bush.
Yeah, which I know seems like the oddest picture, but I think a couple key takeaways from that are Moses in the Old Testament experiences and connects with God in a way nobody else does until you see Jesus step onto the scene in the New Testament. Moses is the one that sees God the most clearly of any character in the Old Testament. And in fact, Moses is the one who writes the first 5 books, or the Torah, that we read through here in the Old Testament. And so he has this powerful encounter. A couple things to kind of keep in mind. You see Moses take his sandals off because he's standing on holy ground. You kind of get this sense that Moses is like kind of bowed down, and he's actually having this conversation with God. And I think what you see in the taking the sandals off is just the holiness of God. And yet this holy God who finds ways to come down and connect with his people. And you see God as deliverer. It's also kind of cool because in the story of Exodus, you find out that the people of Israel have been in slavery for 400 years. And yet God, in the midst of this slavery for 400 years, works deliverance that he's going to use to work the ultimate deliverance of bringing Jesus into the world, and makes himself known through this people in a very specific way at a very specific time.
Yeah, so you see God is faithful to his promises. He hasn't forgotten about his people that have been enslaved for so long, and he sends Moses back to Egypt to ask Pharaoh to let the people go. And you'll see through a series of dialogues that Pharaoh won't let the people go, and then God winds up sending down a whole bunch of plagues on the Egyptians, and after 10 of them, he finally breaks Pharaoh down, and Pharaoh agrees and says, all right, you all can go, and the people leave Egypt, but as they're leaving, Pharaoh kind of changes his mind again and says, wait a minute, I can't let these people go. They've been really helpful servants for a really long time, so he pursues after them, and there's this encounter at the Red Sea. And at the Red Sea, you see God work a powerful act of deliverance for his people.
Yeah, and you'll see, the people are up against the sea, and Pharaoh is bearing down on them. And all of a sudden, God, you're sitting there in that moment where you're saying, okay, there's no way out of this. And God shows up and he says to Moses, you're going to part the sea. So Moses parts the sea. The people walk across. And this is kind of a really key thing. Whenever you're reading the Bible, there's not a lot of description. But when there is description, it's really important to key in. And so you hear the people walk across on dry land. So literally God parts the sea and it's dry. which if you think about it, wait a second, waterlogged kind of, ground. And so this kind of shows you that this is kind of the level of the miracle that, they're walking across on dry ground. They get to the other side. Pharaoh, in his arrogance, pursues the people on the dry ground. And then as soon as the last person's across, God allows the waters to crush down. Now, what's really interesting about this battle between Moses and Pharaoh is on one level, you see Moses battling Pharaoh. But really, what you've got is a picture of God battling a false god. Because in Egyptian culture, the Pharaoh was God. So people didn't see the Pharaoh as their king or ruler. They literally saw Pharaoh as their Lord and God. He was the manifestation of God on earth. And so here you've got Pharaoh who claims to be God, and you've got Moses who's speaking for the actual God. And so what you have is a battle between gods, and what you see through the 10 plagues, what you see through the people walking through on dry ground, and then God crushing all of Pharaoh's army, is you see God making this bold statement of God is the one true God. There is no other God that can stand as his equal. And any God that tries to, whether it's a God that we make up in our own minds or a God that someone tries to place over us, is not going to be able to stand against the one true God. And God, even if he has to use miraculous means to do it, will always fulfill his promises, just like he promised to save his people.
Absolutely. So after this grand act of deliverance, the question then becomes, well, what next? What happens to God's people now that they're no longer under Pharaoh's rule? Now they're under God's rule. So what you see in the next few chapters, from about chapters 15 really through the end of the book, is what does it mean to live as God's people under God's rule? And you start off with the stories of the Israelites at Mount Sinai, and you see at Mount Sinai that God gives the law to his people and basically outlines, hey, this is what it means to be my people.
Mm-hmm. And I think, we talked about it last week, but I want to make sure we highlight it again because it's just that important a point, which is all of this comes out of God as Redeemer. And so what you've got to realize about faith, not just the Lutheran faith, but Christian faith in general, and a proper understanding of God, is this realization that God always works and acts, and then he calls his people to work and act in response to what God has already done. Another way to think about it is God always gives first and most. And then anything God asks you to give is not you giving before God already gives, but it's you giving out of response for what God has done. So God doesn't tell his people what they need to do to be his people until he proves and becomes their God through rescuing his people. And it's the same for us as Christians. The very first thing God wants to give anybody is not his law, but rather his grace and his forgiveness. And that's what makes him God, is when he rescues us, he is once again putting himself as God over our life. And then as God, the one who's rescued and redeemed and poured all the good things he has to pour into your life, he then says, okay, how do you live this out as my people, a people who have been redeemed and rescued by God? And the reason that's so important is that's counterintuitive to our understanding of how things should work and any other religion out there. Every other religion says you do and then you receive. Christianity is radically different, and it says you receive and then you do.
Yeah, so you get the actual giving of the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, and then you get a variety of other laws. And then after that, in chapters 32 through 34, you get this kind of shocking account where you see almost immediately after God has given the law to his people, you see what his people do with that law, and they wind up breaking it. They make a god for themselves out of a golden calf. They're afraid that they can't see God anymore. Moses is gone, so they say, well, we need to make a god for ourselves. So they make this calf out of gold, and they wind up worshiping it. And while Moses comes back, he comes off the mountain where he had been for a while and is not happy about the situation. Things don't look like they're going very well, but even in the midst of God's people screwing up royally, you see that God still comes back to them with his mercy and shows himself faithful to his promises.
And guys, don't miss this image. Literally, the people of Israel break the first two commandments as Moses is writing the first two commandments down. Have no other gods before me. Make no graven images of those gods. And so literally, Moses is like writing this on a tablet while the people are down there making a god out of gold. He carries the tablets down and he's like, the very first thing on there is, have no other gods. Make no graven images. And he stares at a big golden calf, and Moses rage quits at this point. You got to believe, like, he picks up the tablets, smashes them, because he's just done. So he actually has to go back up and like get them rewritten after he takes care of this whole God issue, the people making the golden calf. But even when their leader, Moses, rage quits because he's just angry, God is still faithful. Even when the people break the very first two commandments. Like, you're still listening at that point when somebody's giving you the rules. God is still faithful. And I think that's a powerful thing to pull from Exodus.
Absolutely. Yeah, not only to see God as deliverer, kind of one time in a miraculous event, but to see God as someone who consistently stays with his people and keeps making those same promises to them, even though they kind of break the terms of the covenant themselves. And I think for us, or at least for me, as a person who daily breaks God's commandments, it is a powerful message to be reminded that this is a God who's not going to abandon me, that this is a God who's going to stick with me, even though I'm a big-time screw-up.
That's huge. And so, we're going to take that and let it bring us into our second commandment, which in the second year, the kids are now working through the commandments. And the second commandment is simply this: you are not to misuse the name of your God. Now, I think this is really important, because what you also see in Exodus is God's name is holy and it's powerful. In fact, that's where you see Moses, because they're having this kind of conversation back and forth when God shows up in the burning bush and he says, who should I say sent me? Like, what Moses really wanted was for God to share his name with Moses, because if you knew the name of the God, you could invoke that name and you had that God's power. And so God's response to that is so brilliant. God basically looks at Moses and says, you can't know my name. I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you, which is where we get the term Yahweh, which is I am in Hebrew. So I think that's just really cool. So I think it's really important. Casey, how does Luther unpack this one?
Yeah, so Luther unpacks this in a way where he says, so if you remember last week where we were talking about the first commandment, really what the first commandment is concerned with is like where your heart's at.
Yeah.
What do you love most? What do you trust in more than anything else? What Luther says about the second commandment is that the quickest way to the heart is actually through the tongue. So if you want to know what's going on in a person's heart, listen to what they say. So what this commandment is really trying to get at is how do we kind of line that quickest path from the heart with a heart oriented toward God? How can we make our speech something that hallows God, that makes him holy, that honors him, and that makes his name truthful? How do we attach his name to those things that are true, that are good, that are beautiful? And how do we prevent ourselves from attaching his name to those things that are deceptive or untrue or hurtful?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. I love the way Luther puts it here, because I think you're going to find our culture uses God's name a lot. The question is not, does our culture use God's name? The question is, how are they using it? And how is that informing how we use it? Because if you think about even just like how much people watch TV, like how many times do you hear the GD dropped, or you hear Jesus' name dropped as kind of a curse or a swear? And what are we kind of filling our hearts with? Because what we fill our hearts with is kind of what will come out. And so realizing that God's name is holy and powerful, and so not to use it as a way to express your anger, but really to use it too as a way to call on God for prayer and praise but to realize it goes deeper to even how you're using his name, but how are you representing him? Because you will see that people can do unholy things with a veneer of holiness. And kind of what I say is this: just because you call something Christian doesn't make it Christian. And so make sure anything you attach God's name to really embodies the character and work of God.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think it's important for us to see also here kind of the positive and the negatives. You're going to see this in a lot of Luther's explanations to the commandments moving forward, that there's kind of this prohibition, all right, don't do this in this commandment, but then on the flip side, let's make sure you do this. And I want to highlight for all of us that these commandments are so much more than just a list of do's and don'ts. This isn't like just so that you can check the boxes appropriately. This is really so that you can start to orient your whole life around the will of God. And I think the best place for us to start with that is kind of how we talk.
Well, hey guys, it's been fun hanging out with you right here on Confirmation 2.0. Next week, we're going to be diving into the fun books of the Bible: Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Don't worry, you don't have to read them all, but we're going to be talking about those 3 books specifically. And then we're going to dive into the 3rd commandment, which is the last commandment that deals with our relationship with God, before we start diving into the 4th through 10th commandments, which deal with our relationship with our neighbors. So, till next time, it's been a real joy hanging out with you right here on Confirmation 2.0.